So again, hi guys. Sorry I'm not with you there in person. This was the notice that I got yesterday, right about 9 o'clock local time in the morning. And upon calling American Airlines, there were no options for me to get to Colorado Springs, to Denver, before 1 o'clock Mountain Time today. So sadly, was unable to make it. So I really spent a lot of time sort of crying my eyes out yesterday afternoon. But hopefully this will be a good substitute. Thanks to Kim for facilitating the online version of this, so at least we could share that information with you guys. So awesome. And again, the visual still working okay? We're doing good? All right. So this topic really dovetails very well with what we heard from Asbel, what we just heard from the previous presenter, Kelly. She did a great job. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we want to make sure that not only, and we'll do this very quickly, the economic pressures you guys have gotten a good handle on already, but how does your agency, how can your agencies establish a fee schedule that is compliant, but also represents your true cost of providing service? In the last session, you guys learned a lot about cost reporting. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but really look at if you are going to change your fee schedule. And I got to tell you, we're getting questions literally every day helping agencies change their fee schedule to a more conducive fee schedule, shall we say. In some cases, it's slightly controversial, but it's something that really, if we want to improve our financial sustainability, then it's something that we really have to do. And if we understand that we are healthcare providers and we provide a valuable healthcare service in the community, then this is something that we really need to grab the bull by the horns and make sure that we're doing it, because not only does it impact our revenue stream, but it impacts our compliance. And you heard Asbel talk a little bit about that this morning during his presentation regarding some of the audits that are being done. So we really want to make sure that we're doing that. When we go around the country and we ask people, what is the current state of EMS? The answer that we're getting most of the time right now is on life support. And for those of you in Colorado, this is very true. The economic model, the staffing model, you name it, there are challenges happening all over the place. It is not, as many of you know, just in Colorado, and not just in your local community. The American Ambulance Association and AIM High have the EMS Intel log that we've been tracking for several years now, and financial sustainability, the number one issue in most of those local news reports. And right now we're tracking over about 3,500 of them. Staffing shortages, which arguably tie pretty directly to financial sustainability, the equipment availability, and the challenges with tariffs and things that we're hearing about pretty regularly that could exacerbate those particular issues are becoming even more concerning. The lack of understanding by our public about what EMS really is. If you were to stop Joe Sixpack on the street and ask him what percentage of the calls that we respond to are truly a life-threatening emergency, they would tell you, well, gosh, 80, 90%. But we know, those of you in the room and those of us that are sort of on the inside skinny here, that very few of the calls but they expect that we're going to, have a certain service level, which in many cases might be unrealistic based on, or certainly unnecessary based on the patient's clinical presentation. So there's just some examples about the stories that are happening around the country. Just know that when you're struggling in your local community, it's not you, it's the industry. It's the economic model, it's the staffing model, it's the public expectation. One of the best references that you can use today to talk about the economic plight in EMS is the GADS report. So when this report came out, and there were several webinars that were done, Doug Wolfberg and I did a great webinar on this. But basically, Medicare was able through, or CMS was able through their contractor, RAND, who did a great job, by the way, Dr. Mulcahy, was able to identify the fact that, across all NPIs, National Provider Identifiers, there is a pretty significant cost in completing an ambulance transport. I often refer to it as putting an ambulance in front of an address. But if you look at across all NPIs, the average mean cost of a transport in this particular case, $1,800. For nonprofit agencies, 1784 as opposed to 1845. For profit agencies, about 1,400, but you're seeing a pattern here. And for public safety agencies, which is primarily fire, their cost per transport is about 2,280. Now, when you compare that to the revenue across all payers, the revenue that we generate, there's about a $715 shortfall or a 53% under reimbursement for ambulance services across the country. If you're a public safety provider, that gap is much higher. If you're a for-profit provider, that gap is a little bit lower. But the reality is, across all providers, or across all payers, I should say, our reimbursement is less than the cost of providing service. And that's not us saying it, that is the federal government saying that. They proved that in their GADS report. Now, through PWW Advisory Group, we have published several documents that could also be very beneficial for you as you talk about issues in your local community. We've done now 2 quarterly EMS financial indexes, and we're going to talk, or indices, I guess, Tim, before you correct me, indices that you could find very valuable. I'm going to give you some screenshots, and it'll be in the handouts that we get at the end, or that you get at the end, to kind of look regionally based on your area, your region, but also nationally. What are some of these key financial metrics? And when you get the handout, the link will be there. You can literally just click on it, register, and download these free documents because they're going to be very valuable for you. One of the things that we found early on, and we looked at specifically, was what are people charging? Because this is really what we're talking about in this session, is are you charging a reasonable fee and a compliant fee based on the value and the cost that you're bringing to that community? Now you'll notice some patterns here. So the blue bars are the ALS emergency charges. These are the average base fees, not mileage and everything combined, but just what's the base fee for an ALS emergency or a BLS emergency. And there's some significant variations here. Some would say, well, the Southeast only charging, $893 on average for an ALS emergency call. Well, maybe their costs are lower. I don't believe so, because we've looked at a ton of cost reports. And what's happening here is that in most cases, they are likely billing less than the cost of providing the service. Now, many of you will probably say, well, we're rate regulated in our state or our local county or our local community establishes those rates. This is a time, as Kelly mentioned, as you heard Aswell talk about earlier, you really need to start having those conversations about what is your true cost of providing service. And if you don't know the answer to that question, you're excused from the rest of the session, so you can go start working on that analysis. But what we tell people is you want to try and assure that the fee that you're charging is certainly more than your cost of providing service, but I would argue that you need to charge a fee at a level where your net receivables, the amount that you are paid, is more than the cost of your service. So as many of you know, and you heard it talked about in the previous session, if the average net collection percentage is 46%, then you need to charge a rate that's going to be way above that so that you can collect the amount that's going to be greater than the cost of your service delivery. Now, in your local community, if they decide that they don't want you to bill that high, and therefore they're willing to subsidize your costs, either because you're in a rural community or they want a service level that the fee-for-service revenue will not support, that's fine. But they have to know that they're subsidizing payers who, in many places, should be paying for those services. Now, notice here in the West, the fees are much higher in the West. Now, some would argue that the costs are also much higher, but it is not unusual. And we do a lot of work with agencies in California. I was just on a phone call this morning, as a matter of fact, with an agency in California who is about to approve, believe it or not, a 48 for an ALS emergency call, $4,800. But that's not too far off of the market rate from where they are in California. So you do have to take that a little bit in stride, but also know that you should know, again, your cost of service, your cost of readiness, all that kind of stuff. We're going to talk more about here in just a minute. But there is wide variation, and you can use this information. So if you're in the Southwest and you're currently charging $600, $800 a call, you could point to some of this data and say, well, the regional providers in the Southwest area are charging, $1,100, $1,200, and you can even refine that and get a little bit more local if you need to. One of the other things that we reported in the Q1 report was how much you're actually collecting. Now you'll notice that there's a very close correlation and a very similar chart here that it appears that the more that you bill, the more that you collect. And that goes exactly to the previous presentation where in most cases commercial insurers are reimbursing at 80% of the usual and customary, whatever terminology that you want to use. But generally, the commercial insurers are the reimbursements that change more dramatically when you are changing your fee structure. Patient payments, we'll talk about that in a minute, really doesn't change. Obviously, Medicare and Medicaid are paid on a fixed fee schedule, so you're not going to see really any increases in the reimbursement from Medicare and Medicaid, but commercial insurance is really where that comes into play. Now, when we looked at the GADS report, we had some hope, right? We said, holy crap, good. So now, at least for the first tranche of this information, the year one, year two cohort, it shows a $715 deficit. So and by the way, the Medicare deficit is much higher than that. Medicare deficit was almost $1,100. So that we had hoped that perhaps Medicare, CMS, will now be compelled to some extent to change their fee schedule, right? Because now there's empirical evidence that shows they are under reimbursing. For those of you that aren't aware, when MedPAC, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, met in March, they discussed the GADS report. Now, MedPAC is the organization that makes the recommendations to CMS and others on what some of these reimbursement policies and levels should be. In their presentation about the information that they received from CMS for the GADS report, they found a couple things. One, kudos to you all, because there was a relatively high submission rate. It's about a 70 to 80% submission rate. So kudos to all of you that participated, because that was a great way to really show that the industry, the profession, is engaged in this process. We want to participate. We want to help drive our own future to some extent, to the extent that we can, given the political environment that we're in currently. But again, they collected about 3,800 fully completed cost reports. Now, they did collect about 5,300 in total, but most of those, not most, but some of those 5,300 did not have complete information. Now, they were able to use some of it. So in the report, you'll see that they have an N of 5,100 or 5,300. In some cases, they have an N of 3,800. Just depending on the metric that they were using, they vary just a little bit. But again, 70 to 80% participation rate, outstanding. That was very good. Now, here's one of the concerns. MedPAC said during the meeting that they have a concern on the data integrity for organizations that have shared costs. So then any organization that reports that they share costs with another department within their own agency, whatever that is, MedPAC's current plan, published plan, is to eliminate those from their analysis. The problem with that determination is that 91% of the fire department agencies that submitted a cost report indicated they had shared expenses. So with that one policy decision, MedPAC is going to eliminate 55% of the cost reports because the agencies had shared costs. And from looking extensively at the data, many of us will tell you that those agencies also had the highest cost. So they're going to eliminate the highest cost submissions from the analysis. Second thing that they said was that they're going to drop from the analysis any cost reports that had a standard that had more than a 3 standard deviation variance from the median. Now, for those of you in rural Colorado, your cost per call is going to be dramatically higher than Denver Health because your cost of readiness is through the roof because you're staffing units 24/7 and you're responding to very few calls. So by eliminating both the fire department-based services and the rural services, they're essentially only going to be looking at the high volume urban commercial ambulance providers, and those costs are the lowest costs in that entire cohort. So if we were hoping that we would have hope on the horizon, it's not going to happen because again, based on current statements from MedPAC, now they may change that, and a lot of us are pressuring MedPAC to not do this because we really want a fair evaluation. And if you're eliminating 56% of the cost reports, that is no longer now a representative sample. So again, just know that hope on the horizon is only if we can actually do it. The other thing that we're seeing happen across many states is patient protection balance billing legislation being passed. I know in Colorado, you guys have struggled with that just a little bit. Some states have also struggled. The commercial insurance industry tends to push back very hard on these patient protection legislations, let's call it that. I hate the term surprise billing and all that sort of stuff. Really, it's surprise payment, as you may have heard some people talk about. But we're seeing more and more states doing this. I particularly like the Texas balance billing patient protection legislation because in that language, like it says in several other patient protection legislation, it says if your community, your city, your county, whoever it is, has set ambulance rates and approved those ambulance rates, then the commercial insurers have to pay the bill charge because a local community has established, an elected body has approved these rates to be charged. That was a guardrail that you may remember the Ground Ambulance Patient Billing Advisory Committee put into place when they basically said the same thing. As long as the rates are approved at a local level and the elected officials agree that that's a fair fee, et cetera, then that's what the commercial insurer should pay. Now, in the absence of having locally approved rates, the legislation across the 17, 18 states that have passed these already tend to vary. 300% of Medicare, 350, 400. Michigan, I think, just passed 400% of Medicare. It's North Dakota, believe it or not, was 110% of Medicare, which I told them why bother. It's just, but that because Blue Cross Blue Shield pushed back hard in North Dakota and they got the legislature to approve only 110% of the Medicare rate if you're not contracted for a different rate, which I would argue none of the payers would contract for a rate any higher than that because why would they? It wouldn't make any sense. California did a very similar thing that, again, if the local LEMSA, the local community has approved that rate, then that's what the commercial insurer has to pay. The challenge with these state level balance billing laws, as many of you know in the room, they only apply to state regulated health plans. And according to several reports, including one recently from the Kaiser Family Foundation, state regulated plans only represent about 16% of the commercially insured population in any given state. And I will also share with you from experience working through the Texas issue, it is a quagmire trying to figure out if Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas Plan A is state regulated, Plan B is not state regulated, Plan C, because they're all different. So just because you have a Kaiser commercially insured patient in Colorado, you don't know if that's an ERISA regulated plan or a state regulated plan. It is complicated. And the insurance companies will tell you this happens in California all the time that, oh no, we're a federal plan, we're not a state regulated plan, so we don't have to pay bill charges. And somehow they leave it on the provider to be able to prove that no, you are a state regulated plan. So just think about that as you folks in Colorado begin to relook at balance billing legislation, patient protection legislation. How do you guard against some of that? Here's a link that you'll get in the handouts as well. The National Conference of State Legislatures does a good job tracking this. By the way, when you click on this link, when you get the handout at the end of the presentation, there's all sorts of things you can search for. Whether it's essential service designation, balance billing, you name it, community paramedicine, mobile integrated healthcare, even billing fees and things like that, credit card fees. You can search this database. It's a very comprehensive database. I know that Tim and the folks at NAEMT on the advocacy side and the economics committee use a lot of this information pretty regularly. The Commonwealth also does a really good job in looking at what states have EMS balance billing protections, or I should say balance billing protections that also apply to EMS and emergency services. So you can click on any of these links and they can help you determine and even find some sample legislation language that you may want to use as you go down this road again in Colorado. I know that Tim and others there are working really hard on that. Okay, so let's say that you're going to really want to take a look at changing your fee structure. So we had a benefit recently of working with a community in California, and for years, their ALS emergency fee was $600. Now, again, this is California. $4,500 is not unreasonable in California, but they'd been charging $600 forever. And the reason that they did that was they said, hey, we get tax dollars, we get a benefit fee that we assess on the community, therefore we want to make sure that we're, not overcharging people. Well, the problem was that their transport fee, being so stagnant, was not covering the cost of service anymore. And they really needed to take a hard look at whether or not they were going to be able to continue operating at the level of the service that the community wanted. So I'll show you this example. So we did this analysis and we showed them that your fee for service gap between the cost of providing the service and the revenue fee for service that's being generated is really running $150, $200 per transport. So they were relying on the benefit fee and they were on the taxes and the benefit fees to cover that cost. I tend to be a little bit fiscally conservative, and our philosophy here was, why should the taxpayers have to pay a fee to subsidize the commercial insurers? Because if there are commercial insurers in the next county that are paying $3,000 for an ambulance transport and you're only charging them $600, that difference is being underwritten by the taxpayer. And that's not right. So perhaps raise your fee, collect more commercial insurance, reduce your tax rate, reduce the tax subsidy that the system is using, or turn it back and hire more cops, hire more firefighters, build parks, do whatever. But don't use it to subsidize Kaiser, because they've got more money than they can shake a stick at, and the commercial insurers are making record profits. So why are we using tax dollars to subsidize them by what our Medicaid commissioner refers to is charging a nominal fee as opposed to what it really costs to deliver that service? Now, in this discussion, we had to arm the county stakeholders with message points. And the message points really centered around the fact about who's going to be impacted by a rate change, by a fee schedule increase. Well, in their system, the Medicare payer mix is 40%, right? 38% Medicare, 25, 28%, 26% Medicare HMO. So those patients, this has no impact on. You could charge 500, you could charge 5,000. The fee schedule is the fee schedule. They're only going to be responsible for the deductible and copays. So any change that you make in that fee is not going to impact the Medicare population, which people get really concerned about. The next is the Medicaid population. So again, those are fixed fees. This is paid on a fee schedule. Those patients aren't going to see any difference between a $500 bill and a $5,000 bill, because you're only going to get reimbursed $280, whatever it is that you get for the Medicaid, and that's it. So the only patients, and by the way, I would also argue that the self-pay, that 5.8%, they're not going to pay if the bill is 500. They're not going to pay if the bill is 5,000. So even those patients are going to have very minimal impact in any type of fee schedule. But where you really want to have those conversations is that the elected officials, whether locally, on a state level, whatever, really focus on Medicare and Medicaid. Okay, any fee schedule change is not going to impact them. So these are some of the messages that, we're going to change our fee structure to X. We want to maximize third-party reimbursement, because our belief, if this is yours, but my belief is that the insurance companies receive premiums from insurers, from employers, from patients, and they're responsible for paying those. And a fee change will not impact, and this is the exact example from this community in California, 73% of the patients are going to have no impact. And by the way, in their particular case, almost 56% of their non-residents, because they charge a different fee based on resident or non-resident, because the non-residents don't pay that tax. So instead of charging them $600, they charge them $1,200. Well, big deal. When the county next door was charging $3,600. Also, implement a no balance billing policy for the residents. So if you are tax funded and your residents use your service and they take an ambulance to the hospital, so you can have a policy that says you're going to write off that balance. If there's a balance between what the insurance company pays and what the patient owes, because you can say, hey, for the residents who pay taxes, they're funding our system, we're going to waive the balance bill for them, and then simultaneously implement a charity care policy. Now, There's a lot of discussion about being compassionate billing and charity care policies. When I was at MedStar, we had a fairly liberal charity care policy. If somebody called and said, I can't afford to pay this bill, we charged $1,900 for an ALS emergency call. So I can't afford to pay it. We said, well, can you afford to pay half? No, I can't. Okay, then we'll just write it off. Well, that seemed to be a little bit too liberal in my view. So we changed our policy to if they want to claim poverty level. So our policy was if the patient had, if their household income was 400% of the federal poverty level or less, they were eligible for charity care, either reduced rate or total write-off. We started asking for documentation. So when people called and said, hey, single mom, can't afford it, I'm not going to pay it. Okay, we can waive this for you. Our policy is that if you're 400% of federal poverty level household income, we'll reduce your rate by 50%. If you're at 200% of the federal poverty level, we waive it altogether. But in order to do that, you need to send us your 1040 from last year. Oh my gosh. Um, the people push back and all sorts of stuff. But we found that the vast majority of people who were claiming, because they were uninsured, that were claiming that they couldn't pay the bill, they could. They just chose not to. So we got a little bit more forceful and said, if you want us to not send this to collections, governmental entity, no subsidy, we really want to maximize our revenue, then you need to send us the front page of your 1040. And if it shows from last year that you are at 200% of federal poverty level, we're going to discount your bill 50%, or in that particular case, 100%. Think about that because people will claim it, but ask them to show the proof. We did get the county and the advisory board for this area to approve the rate increase. And their rates went from $600 for an ALS emergency call to $3,600 for an ALS emergency call. And that started last July 1st. And what that did for that service provider, it's a county-based alliance model, if you will, is it eliminated the red from their balance sheet and from their reserves. And it gives them the ability to really consider eliminating part of their tax subsidy. Because you can see as we projected out under the new fee schedule, they went from an average collections of 533 to this year an average collection of 873, and then it goes up a little bit each time from there. They're putting money in the bank. So they can actually now consider doing different things and perhaps reducing their tax subsidy. So it works well when you do it. You heard Asbel talk a lot about GEMT, and I think the previous speaker spoke about GEMT as well. So I won't take a lot of time on this, but just know that, and I don't know, somebody call it out so I know for sure. Is Colorado a GEMT state? Yes, no?
That is.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so you do need to get worried, and I think that the previous speaker had mentioned that as well. So just be aware, and it's not as Asbel said, and we've said, it's not the changes in the HR1 that's going to be the big concern. It's the state plan amendments that have to be renewed every year, every 2 years, 3 years, whatever the case might be. Remember that for public agencies, the average cost for an ambulance ride to the hospital, which is the covered service, $1,800, $2,300, and the Medicaid reimbursement in Colorado is probably way less than that. Supplemental payments have some good foundation for doing them. When I was at MedStar, we were a GEMT recipient, and we got $1.2, $1.4 million a year from the GEMT program. One of the things that we found when we went into the balanced billing discussions, and then that tied into the GEMT discussion, was that in order for us to be able to show locally published and approved rates as part of the legislation, the Texas Department of Insurance created a database of locally approved charges. So this is a screenshot from that database. It was online, and communities could fill in their locally approved AO427, AO429, AO425, fill in their rates. So when the insurance companies who were state regulated got the bill from Addison Fire for an AO 429 claim, they could look this up and say, okay, yep, the published rate is $1,400. We have to pay $1,400, less deductible coinsurance, whatever. But that then became the allowable amount. What we found when we did this is that there were a number of agencies across Texas that were charging $500-600 for an ALS emergency call, which raised some questions on the part of the state Medicaid office. And they said, you guys are submitting you're submitting cost reports to the state Medicaid office for GEMT that shows that your cost of providing ambulance service is $2,800 a call, but you're charging $750. Why are you doing that? And that came up during a big meeting that we had with the state regarding the GEMT program back in 2022. And when one of the fire agency chiefs said, well, our city council artificially reduces the ambulance bill so that the residents don't complain about getting a high ambulance bill. So therefore, that's why we charge what the Medicaid commissioner called a nominal fee. So her comment, for example, for the city of Carrollton, is if you're charging $850 and your cost report says that it costs you $2,200 to put an ambulance in front of an address, you're sending a nominal bill. Why aren't you billing your cost? And when the fire chief said that, she said, Chief, bad public policy on your part is not my problem. Because one of the changes that was being considered and was eventually adopted by the state and adopted by CMS in Texas's GEMT program was we're not going to base it entirely on cost anymore. In fact, they were going to really not use the cost of providing the service at all. And they were going to use the average difference between the Medicaid payment and the average commercial payment for that community, for that provider. So at MedStar, we were thrilled because our cost per call was $450. The commercial reimbursement that we were getting was about $1,350. But these other departments whose costs were $2,200-2,300 and they were getting reimbursed $500, the Medicaid reimbursement was $280, so the gap between the Medicaid reimbursement and the commercial reimbursement was $200. Well, for us, it was $1,000. So it seemed like a much more reasonable way, in our view, to do that. And part of that reason was, again, we were getting 1.2, 1.4 million because our cost was low, but we were charging high because we weren't subsidized. But other departments were getting $9 million, $10 million for GEMT supplemental payments because their costs were $2,400, $2,500 a call. And we shared at the state Medicaid office that you are rewarding inefficiency. And that doesn't make any sense. So we should just change our model, increase our cost per call so we can get more of the government's money to supplement the cost. So Texas redid their GEMT program. And we'll talk more about that later, but I think coming up. So this is what happened in some of these communities. So we want to look at what the gross APC was. So for this particular community in California, this is what they were billing and this is what they were getting back. One of the things that we noticed in doing some of this analysis for them is that when we looked at the Medicaid collection rate, they had a collection percentage for Medicaid claims that was more than they were getting back more than they were billing. And this raised a bit of a red flag. And we asked, hey, so how does this work? That you have a 129, 110, 122% higher reimbursement from Medicaid than you were getting in the average payment or in the average charge. And what we found was that under the GEMT program, the Medicaid HMOs were paying the GEMT rate as a reimbursement even when the bill was less than the GEMT rate. So again, in this community for August of 2024, their average patient charge was $724 for a Medicaid patient, but their average collection was 985. And that was a bit of a problem. It was finally realized by the payers that they were doing that. They were reimbursing the GEMT rate, even though it was more than what they were being billed. So they went back to the statute that created the GEMT program and found this language. Medicare payment for ambulance services is based on the lesser of the actual charge for applicable fee in the fee schedule amount. This is the Medicare language, but the payer said the same thing applies to Medicare. I'm sorry, to Medicaid. We should not have to pay more than we're being billed. And they're right. So what we saw in that community in California, now we're seeing in other places, the insurers are rebasing and clawing back what they believe to be their overpayments. And they're saying, listen, for the last year, we've overpaid you because we paid you more than you billed. And we've overpaid you $400,000. So we're going to stop paying until we catch up. Or you can write us a check for 400,000, whatever you want. So the message there, compliant fee schedule, charge what you're worth, etc. In no case should you be billing less than what you are receiving in GEMT. So in Illinois, for example, they started getting a $2,000 supplemental payment for their Medicaid program under GEMT. Many of the agencies weren't even charging $2,000. So they started what the state said is you should bill a different code to bump up your fee so that your fee is going to be less than the Medicaid allowable or less than the Medicaid payment. So if you look at a ambulance claim in the state of Illinois for a public provider, they may bill a base rate of $1,200, mileage was, whatever, but then they add an AO 399 supplemental fee to their bill of $2,000. And therefore their total bill is, $3,000, they get reimbursed $2,000. It's crazy. But go back to what Asbel said about the Paragon Group and how those guys really don't like these programs because they've said it is money laundering. And that's exactly what it is. So just in Colorado, pay very close attention to this. Make sure you're not getting reimbursed more than you're submitting for the bill under any type of supplemental payment program. So just so you know, and that is going to be a compliance risk. All right. So takeaways from this particular section, just make sure that you're billing the services that are billing the cost of providing that service. Again, in most cases that we've done this, a good system is costing $1,000 to put an ambulance in front of an address. So you got to make sure that you're doing that. Second is you need to convince your elected officials that using tax dollars or district fees, if you're a district, but using those district fees to subsidize the insurance companies isn't good public policy. And again, by changing these fee structures, you're not going to hurt the Medicare patients, the Medicaid patients, etc. Being good public servants means being good stewards of their money. And they will appreciate when you say, hey, we're going to increase our fees. The people who are paying the service or who are using the service will pay for it. And as a result, we're going to reduce the tax rate by 0.2 of a mil. Oh, you'll be a hero. You might be the mayor next election. But as you've heard from the last presentation, please make sure you're calculating your costs. We recommend that your costs should be calculated on a per unit hour basis, a per response basis, a per patient contact basis, because that's a little different metric as well, not just a per transport basis, because not every patient that you respond to do you take to the ER or to any other destination. So that you want to have, treat and refer, or you have patients that refuse to go to the hospital, whatever the case might be, calculate your cost per patient contact as well. If you're undercharging, maybe a compliance risk there. Certainly if you're undercharging more than you're getting reimbursed. And if you need help, call somebody. There are many agencies that have gone through this process. When we did our One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBA webinar, we've got a bunch of agencies that were helping with determining what could happen in Colorado if the Medicaid population shifts from 11% of the Medicaid population go to uninsured. What does that look like in your community? What happens if on October 1st, PAYGO is triggered and your Medicare reimbursement gets reduced by another 4% based on your payer mix and your charges and your reimbursements and your allowable, et cetera. So there's always resources out there that you can use to help you through some of these things. With that, I'm going to turn the floor over to someone, Kim probably, to moderate any questions that folks may have about any of this information. And while we're doing that, here is a QR code. I'm going to give Kim a copy of a PDF of this that has all the links and all the stuff that we talked about in here. But if you want it by email, just scan that QR code on your phone. It'll bring up your inherent email system on your smart device. Click send, it'll send me an email, I'll reply and attach the presentation. Kim, questions from the audience or anybody online, because I can't see that either, and I don't want to stop sharing because people might be scanning the QR code.
In the room, that's fine. So, 2 questions, Matt, how you doing, brother, first of all? I'm not gonna type that. What's your question? So the first question is, do you, with the A0 or AO988, we've heard rumor that some insurance companies are starting to pay that more frequently, even if you are not a contracted agency with them. What is your experience with that? And then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, stay tuned for the afternoon session. We're going to go over all that detail because that's, of the alternate payment models, et cetera. But you are spot on. And it is A0998, by the way. Because it's a
A0.
Yep.
And then my second question, this may be for the afternoon session as well, but it's related to Z codes. Do you know of any EMS agencies that are submitting Z codes and are they getting paid for that?
Yes, they are. There are agencies that are submitting Z codes. They are primarily under a mobile integrated healthcare program. They're doing G, they're doing Z, they're doing straight up CPT code. That also will be covered this afternoon. But I have not heard of many agencies using Z codes or even G codes for a traditional ambulance response, whether or not the patient gets transported to the hospital. Those that are getting reimbursed for treatment in place are using the AO998.
Questions?
Jim?
Yes, Tim.
Matt, yesterday in the Economics Committee for NAEMT, we did discuss the MedPAC report and the lack of including all those agencies. I did get an email from Kim Krennick this morning that said that MedPAC did not eliminate the groups we discussed, they just didn't include them in the preliminary report due to the outliers. She said that all will be included in the final report. MedPAC was not ready to release it in the preliminary report. So that's the latest we got from Kim on the MedPAC.
I would love to see that in writing from MedPAC because their in writing presentation in March was they are dropping them. So if they've decided not to drop them, send us that in writing. Honestly, they also said that one of the reasons that they're doing it is because they did the same thing last time they did a cost analysis in 2002 or whatever it was that they did it last time, and they wanted to be consistent by dropping the shared cost providers that they dropped in 2012. So when they do the 2024 now, 2026 analysis, they're using the same cohort. So I am not optimistic that they're going to include those. Maybe wrong, but we'll see.